Okay, we'll spend a few minutes talking about some particular guidelines. We discussed validity, we discussed reliability, we've mentioned just a couple of things we can do to make sure we're measuring things more reliably and more validly. Let me just talk just about a few kind of issues we want to talk about when you're putting an instrument together. Now by an instrument, I mean an instrument essentially is measuring something, and that can be a test to measure something in terms of content or whatever, or it can be a questionnaire or survey. I suspect that most of you are going to be doing something in terms of probably survey if you do one of these or the other. Let me also say that in terms of instrumentation, whatever means you're using for data collection for your dissertation, there's going to be some kind of instruments going to be involved. Now, that instrument can be either one that you construct for your own purpose, and that's what we're going to talk about more specifically, or if you can find an existing instrument that you can use, and by saying that you can use means that you have permission to use and you're legally and authorized or whatever, that's okay. A permission might be, in an existing instrument, you typically need permission from the author. There are some instruments that you have to pay a fee to use. There are some instruments that you have to be trained to use, and you can't use them otherwise. So the reason to use an existing instrument is because, well, you don't have to develop it. It probably has established validity and reliability. You can get data on that. It's been used for different things, and you can report what it's been used for. But you may have to construct your own instrument because maybe you can't find something that measures exactly what you wanted to measure. Or maybe you can't find something that you're able to use for whatever reason. The author won't let you or whatever. Most authors, if you look at instrumentations in other research projects, especially like dissertations, if you'll just contact the author, usually most people are just pretty happy for you to use that. Just give them credit, and they may want to see a copy of your results. But a lot of people are, I'd say most people are pretty cooperative. Some people tend to be a little more protective because maybe they're using it commercially and they don't want you to use it for free, which I think is legitimate too. So if you can find an existing instrument, in many ways it's better or it may be easier, but if you can't, you've got to construct your own. So it's the constructing your own part I want to talk about now just a little bit. Just some general issues, some guidelines, some things to keep in mind as you put this together. And whether you do it for your dissertation or not, there's an assignment that I'll talk about in a little bit about putting an instrument together. So pay attention to sentence length. I've got some examples here for these issues that show you how something was originally written and how it can be better revised. For example, here's my original sentence. And this might be something that would show up on a Likert scale where you respond from like a 1 to 5 scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Okay, so here's the sentence you're responding to. Depending on the availability of resources, my supervisor provides me with the opportunity to attend training that can help me do my job better, which is relative to my job duties. I got lost about halfway through that. What if I just say something like, management supports training that is job relevant? Shorter is better in this case. Kind of like the old saying goes, never use a big word when a diminutive one will suffice. Be careful that you're not dealing with too many concepts at once. For example, if I say, do you buy frozen microwavable food? And if so, how many of these items do you produce or do you purchase each week? Well, there are two things going on here. First of all, do you buy them at all? And then, if so, how much do you buy them? Well, what if we just say, hey, about how many do you buy each week? And if you don't buy them at all, you've got an option to say none or very little. So the revision would be better to say, about how many frozen microwavable food items do you purchase each week? Rather than asking it in a compound kind of way. Question was, do the intervals need to be even? Not necessarily. Sometimes the intervals you use, that's a good question, and I'm going to give you a couple of some content to where that may or may not matter. There may be a reason for having certain intervals. For example, if you're collecting data from teachers and you've got a question, how many years have you been on the job? Your first interval might be 0 to 3 to indicate non-tenure. And then, so there may be some career stepping stones that occur at certain years, so you might want to use that as intervals. So not necessarily, the intervals don't necessarily have to be the same. They need to make sense. In some ways, sometimes what makes sense isn't equal intervals. Here's another one, too many concepts. The automobile tax should be repealed and the tax on food should be reduced. Well, I'm asking about two different kinds of taxing and two different kinds of things. What if I think that the automobile tax should be repealed, but the tax on food should not be reduced? There's no way to say that. So what if I ask them two different ways? The automobile sales tax should be repealed as one item, and the tax on food should be reduced as one item. And by the way, notice I'm trying to, when I can remember to, I'm using the word item and not questions, because these aren't questions. They're items. Not every item's a question. Question has a question mark to it. These are the statements to which you respond in this Likert scale kind of way. Terminology. Make sure your terminology is clear. For example, given increased gang activity in local communities and schools, LEA should receive additional funding. What's an LEA? Say that louder? Yeah, say it louder, because you might be right. Local. Okay, local education agency. It might be that. Local education, what did you say it was? Association? It might be that. I don't know. Oh, I've got another one that would also fit the context. Usually local education agency is what I think of, but you're right, association could work too. It could be law enforcement agency, which would still fit the context of the question. So I don't know. So make sure your terms are defined. So I don't know what LEA means. I'm not sure I know what gang activity means. There may be some others that I don't know. So I would revise that to say, and I've just put a question mark there, if LEA is the questionable term, just say what LEA means. Say it means a local education agency, if that's what it means. If it means law enforcement agency, say law enforcement agency. So make sure terms are defined, and especially with abbreviations and acronyms and things like that. Because sometimes the same letter code could mean two different things, each of which might work. So, for example, if I thought, I want to increase the local education agency's funding, but I wouldn't want to increase the law enforcement agency's funding. I don't have a way to answer that because I don't know what they're asking. Okay. Make sure you've got enough choices. So, let's say we ask, what type of dwelling do you now reside? House, apartment, or other? Well, other kind of covers everything, but it's probably not specific enough. What if I add like townhouse and mobile home and maybe a hotel, motel, rooming house, or other that's not specified? What if someone's homeless? I mean, people collect data with homeless people sometimes. Or I live in an RV, okay? Yeah. So you want to make sure you have enough choices to where you can find what's probably going to be there. You're also not going to be able to think of everything like this, so it's not bad to have an other, but don't let other be the catch-all for where do you reside, house or other? That's not very helpful. Sensitive items. Original. Was this child born out of wedlock? And by the way, that is the edited version. Could have been worse. What if I say, and I don't know if this is much less offensive, but it seems to be at least a little bit. What if I say, what was your marital status when your most recent child was born? Is that a little better? I think it's still a sensitive question, but probably not as bad as the original item was written. Depends what is the question. Should you even have those? Well, it depends what data you need to collect. I don't know. If this is pertinent data, and it could be in some research questions, yeah, this might be something you need to know. I would suggest if it's not pertinent to your study, don't ask it. Well, they're steering away from it, and sometimes I think other things are becoming more sensitive. So it depends, I guess. Here's one of my favorite biased items: misleading or leading. Do you believe the IRS should be abolished? Okay, no hesitancy there. yeah. This is, it's kind of like those, well, let me rephrase. Do you still cheat on your taxes? There's no way to. How about if I say, what do you think we ought to do about the IRS? And they might have options to where you might think, yeah, that's good. That more than one thing might be a desirable option that I would see as. So it's kind of like I tell if you're when you're filling out an evaluation on my teaching, if you say I stink, tell me what stinks. Just telling me I stink doesn't help me any. Oh, it stinks the way you did this, and so here's why it stinks. Okay, that helps me. But if you just give me a blanket general statement, yeah, the IRS should be abolished. Well, that doesn't tell me why you think that or what would be helpful or constructive to do otherwise. So be more specific with those things. Again, global terms and responses, and this has a little bit to do with those undefined terms again. How often do you go to the movies? Never attend, infrequently, sometimes, often, regularly attend. Anybody remember the movie Annie Hall? Okay, this is like a long time ago. There's a scene in Annie Hall where Woody Allen is talking with some of his friends in one circle. Diane Keaton is talking with some of her friends in another. This is why I can no longer teach undergraduates, because this doesn't go anywhere with them. And it's working worse and worse for the graduate students as time goes by. Anyway, so Diane Keaton is talking in her circles of friends, and they're talking about the frequency of something. And Woody Allen says, practically never, like maybe 3 times a week. Diane Keaton gets the same question. She says, like all the time, like 3 times a week. So the answer was the same, but what it meant was different. So if you look at undefined terms like infrequency or sometimes or often, I don't know what that means. People aren't going to see those to mean the same things. So let's ask, how often do you go to the movie? Same question, same stem of the question, or it is a question. Never, once or twice a year, once a month, once a week, more than once a week. Okay, that pins down. If I think as once a week is infrequently, I got a place to check that. Somebody else might think once a week is just like regularly. But we're specific in terms of what we mean by those things. Other issues to concern ourselves with. Reading level. Don't give a high school English test to a 3rd grader. Or vice versa. Directions. This is overlooked because a lot of times we think, well, you know what to do. Well, maybe, maybe not. If you want them to circle the letter, tell them to circle the letter. Tell them, when you're measuring something, whether it's content, perception, or whatever, When you measure something, be clear in terms of how they can help. They can give you the information you're looking for. Don't make them have to figure out the test. It's not a good test, and I use this for tests specifically. It's not a good test. Figuring out the test is not what you're supposed to be measuring. If you're giving an English test, you're supposed to be measuring English, not whether you can figure out the test or not. Now we've all done sort of the when in doubt pick C thing. That shouldn't be true. Sometimes it is, but it shouldn't be. Or another thing we do sometimes is we give clues. Well, we've all done these. We've all taken these tests where I don't know what the next answer is. I'll come back to it later, and the next question gives me the answer. I've written those. Benefited a lot from them. Anyway, so directions are important, and again, help them give you the information you're looking for. Use good grammar. Spell some of the words right. Multicultural considerations. Again, what we say may be perceived some other way by other cultures. Just be sensitive to that. What are some other things? And yeah, you may be right about the options for that one earlier item we read. It could be. I mean, my point is just to think through and make sure you're giving as much direction and good options as you can. Are there other things to think about? A couple of other guidelines. For example, if you're designing some kind of you're designing some kind of instrument, and you number things, number consecutively. Don't start another section over with number 1 again. Because when you're talking about that, you should have only one number 4 and not 7 number 4s because you got 7 sections. So number consecutively all the way through. If you use different formats, like for example, like on the midterm test you've seen, I put the multiple choice items together. I put the short answer essay items together. Put all the same kinds of formatted items together. Try not to go through, here's a Likert scale item, here's a yes/no question. I'm going to go back to Likert scale. I'm going to throw in an open-ended question here. I'm going to go back to multiple choice. Put all those things together so the respondent is not always having to switch gears. Make sure that the typeface, the font is readable. The question was, okay, on a Likert scale, do we put strongly disagree first or strong? My tendency is to put strongly disagree first, to where the right tends to mean more, but there may be a reason to do it the other way. Now, don't change gears. Be consistent all the way through, but this is just good talking. I put strongly agree to the right, but you may have a reason for not doing that. The question of including a neutral option. Do I want to have a 5-point scale or a 4-point scale? Here's the over/under on that. A 5-point scale, if it's an odd number scale, you'll have a neutral option. The question you have to ask yourself, do you want to let somebody sit on the fence or not? If you don't want to let them sit on the fence, you give what we call a forced choice. That might be a 4-point scale, where the middle of a 4-point scale is, say, if it's 1 to 4, the middle's 2.5. You don't have a 2.5. So I'm not saying one is not necessarily better than the other. You just have to make the decision for what you're trying to measure and the way you're trying to measure it. So neutral option, it depends. Your choice. I don't have a general preference one way or the other. I see it both ways. Another thing, I kept thinking somebody might ask this, but I'll just say it before I see it asked, is where do you put the demographic place? Do you put that at the beginning or the end? Traditionally, we've put it at the beginning. But I'm seeing more and more instruments that put it at the end. What class are you? Freshman, sophomore, junior, senior? I don't know. What's your age? What's your major? Your gender? All those things. Do you put those at the beginning or the end? I don't know. As I say, I'm seeing more and more put toward the end because I think the school of thought on that is that, well, if I've identified certain characteristics of myself, that might, if I have somebody do that up front, that may tend to influence the way they respond. It wouldn't me, but it might somebody. Okay, other things. Those are most of the ones I can think of. What else can you think about? Okay, what do you do if people don't? And this is more of the question of what do you do if people don't respond to something. This is more of a scoring issue than a construction issue. But since you asked it, let's say I've got a bunch of items that are 5-point Likert scale items, so they're going to circle 1 to 5 on everything, and they skip an item. There are a couple of different ways you can deal with that. Yeah, matter of fact, you'll notice if you remember some of the options on the SPSS, and we always kind of defaulted past them, but I pointed it out a couple of times. It had to do with what do you want, how do you handle missing data? That's what that has to do with. If it's a 5-point scale, one thing you can just do is ignore it, throw it out. The other thing you can do is just make it a 3. Give it the mid number. My personal preference is to throw it out. Because if you're trying to do, let's say you're doing a single sample t-test where you're measuring their score against a test value of 3 as the midpoint, see if they're significantly higher or lower, then if they're higher or lower, that 3 is going to pull them back toward that mean when you're wanting to see if they're not toward the mean. So my tendency is to just throw it out. Okay, what have you got? You got different ethnic categories, and you have only one category. Yeah, you can ask the question, but what you might have to is you might have to combine categories. Now, there are some standard federal categories, and depending on your population, you may not have very many in one or more categories. So in that case, you can combine that category with another one. And that's not an uncommon thing to have to do. And again, that's sort of a scoring question, but which is important. I'm not going to say it. Anything else? Okay, so keep those things in mind as you construct instruments, including the instrumentation assignment, which I'll talk about here in just a couple of minutes, or the next one of the next videos.